As we mentioned in the previous lesson, in any application, there are always certain endpoints that should remain public. Take, for example, the sign-in endpoint that lets users log into the system. Unless it's public, no one would be able to access it and actually log in. Right now, in our application, every route is being protected by our access token guard since we registered it globally via AppGuard. But how can we let our application know which routes we want to remain public? To achieve this, let's create a new decorator that lets us flag specific endpoints as unprotected. This will also come in handy in future challenges we will face in upcoming lessons. Let's start things off by creating an enum that will indicate what authentication type we want to use for specific routes. In our im/authentication folder, let's create a new directory named enums, and inside of it, create a new file called auth-type.enum.ts. Inside this file, let's create a simple enum that consists of two values, bearer, which is going to be the default strategy, and none, which indicates we want to skip authentication for a given resource. Next up, we're going to create a decorator named auth. This new decorator will let us choose the strategy for the annotated endpoint or an entire controller. So alongside the newly created enums folder, let's create a new directory called decorators, and inside the folder, create a new auth.decorator.ts file. In this file, let's first declare the metadata key. Next, let's create our custom decorator. If you're not familiar with the set metadata helper here, we recommend looking at the lesson using metadata to build generic guards or interceptors from our fundamental course. With all of this in place, let's head over to our access token guard and start by removing the console log we added in the previous lesson, as we no longer need it. Next, let's open up our terminals and generate a new guard using the Nest CLI. Let's place it within the IAM, Authentication, and Guards folder, and let's call this Authentication. In this guard, we're going to need two dependencies. First being the reflector provider, which gives us access to the underlying metadata, and the second dependency being our access token guard. This may look strange since we're composing a guard from multiple other guards, and we are even injecting the access token guard in the constructor here. But injecting guards in this way, similar to how we typically inject services, is feasible as long as we register our guards as providers in our module's providers array. Next in here, let's declare two properties in our class. One being the static default auth type property, indicating which strategy is the default one. In our case, we'll make that auth type bearer. And another one, this time non-static, which represents the mappings between auth types and their actual corresponding guards. With all of that in place, now let's move on to the canActivate method of our guard. Let's call the reflector's getAll and override method and pass in the auth type key constant as the first argument. For the second argument, we'll be passing in an array that consists of two targets that we want this metadata to be retrieved from, either a class or a handler, aka method reference. By doing all of this, we're able to place our guard on either a class or the method level. Next, using our auth type guard map, let's map auth type values to the corresponding guard instances. Also, let's make sure to declare the error variable that represents the exception to be thrown by the authentication guard in case all guards returned false. And lastly, let's iterate through our guards array and call their respective canActivate methods. If any of the allowed authentication types pass, we return true. Otherwise, our guard will throw the most recent error thrown by the triggered guard or unauthorized exception, which is the default error. Let's save our changes, open up the IAM module, and replace the access token guard with our newly created authentication guard. Let's also make sure to register the access token guard as a provider now, so it becomes injectable for the authentication guard. Perfect. Let's save our changes, head over to Insomnia, and let's test the sign-in endpoint. As we can see, it's now returning a 401, which means it's currently protected by our guard, which is not what we want actually. Let's switch back to our IDE, open up our authentication controller, and apply the auth decorator we created at the beginning of this lesson and apply it to the entire authentication controller class, passing in the auth type none as an input argument. If we save our changes, head back over to Insomnia and test everything again, we'll see, voila, it works. Our sign-in and sign-up routes are now publicly available. We're no longer getting a 401, and users will be able to sign up and sign into our system now. Not only that, but with the help of our auth decorator in the future, we can now make public or make unprotected any other future routes we might need.